The Minsk agreements were a series of international agreements which sought to end the Donbas war fought between armed Russian separatist groups and armed forces of Ukraine, with Russian regular forces playing a central part. The first, known as the Minsk Protocol, was drafted in 2014 by the Trilateral Contact Group on Ukraine, consisting of Ukraine, Russia, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, with mediation by the leaders of France and Germany in the so-called Normandy format. After extensive talks in Minsk, Belarus, the agreement was signed on September 5, 2014 by representatives of the Trilateral Contact Group and, without recognition of their status, by the then leaders of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. This agreement followed multiple previous attempts to stop the fighting in the region and aimed to implement an immediate ceasefire. The agreement failed to stop fighting, and was thus followed with a revised and updated agreement, Minsk II, which was signed on February 12, 2015. This agreement consisted of a package of measures, including a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front line, release of prisoners of war, constitutional reform in Ukraine granting self-government to certain areas of Donbas and restoring control of the state border to the Ukrainian government. While fighting subsided following the agreement's signing, it never ended completely, and the agreement's provisions were never fully implemented. Amid rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine in early 2022, Russia officially recognized the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics on February 21, 2022. Following that decision, on February 22, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin declared that the Minsk agreements no longer existed, and that Ukraine, not Russia, was to blame for their collapse. Russia then invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Minsk Protocol. The Minsk Protocol was drawn up by the Trilateral Contact Group on Ukraine, which consisted of representatives from Ukraine, Russia, and the OSCE. The group was established in June 2014 as a way to facilitate dialogue and resolution of the strife across eastern and southern Ukraine. Meetings of the group, along with informal representatives of the breakaway Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, took place on July 31, August 26, September 1, and September 5, 2014. The details of the agreement, signed on September 5, 2014, largely resembled Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko's June 20, 15-point peace plan. Text of the Protocol. The text of the Protocol consists of 12 points. To ensure an immediate bilateral ceasefire. To ensure the monitoring and verification of the ceasefire by the OSCE. Decentralization of power, including through the adoption of the Ukrainian law on temporary order of local self-governance in particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. To ensure the permanent monitoring of the Ukrainian-Russian border and verification by the OSCE with the creation of security zones in the border regions of Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Immediate release of all hostages and illegally detained persons. A law preventing the prosecution and punishment of people in connection with the events that have taken place in some areas of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. To continue the inclusive national dialogue. To take measures to improve the humanitarian situation in Donbas. To ensure early local elections in accordance with the Ukrainian law on temporary order of local self-governance in particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. To withdraw illegal armed groups and military equipment as well as fighters and mercenaries from the territory of Ukraine. To adopt a program of economic recovery and reconstruction for the Donbas region. To provide personal security for participants in the consultations. Signatories. The following representatives signed the document. Swiss diplomat and OSCE representative Heidi Taliavini. Former President of Ukraine and Ukrainian representative Leonid Kuchma. Russian ambassador to Ukraine and Russian representative Mikhail Zurabov. Rebel heads Alexander Zakharchenko and Igor Plotnitsky. Follow-up memorandum. In the 2 weeks after the Minsk Protocol was signed, there were frequent violations of the ceasefire by both parties to the conflict. Talks continued in Minsk, and a follow-up to the Minsk Protocol was agreed to on September 19, 2014. This memorandum clarified the implementation of the protocol. Amongst some of the peacemaking measures agreed to were to ban flights by combat aircraft over the security zone, to withdraw all foreign mercenaries from the conflict zone, to ban offensive operations, to pull heavy weaponry 15 kilometers back on each side of the line of contact, creating a 30-kilometer buffer zone, to task the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine with monitoring implementation of Minsk Protocol. Efficacy. After the follow-up memorandum, the Second Battle of Donetsk Airport broke out, and both parties continued to accuse each other of ceasefire violations. In late October, DPR Prime Minister and Minsk Protocol signatory Alexander Zakharchenko said that his forces would retake the territory they had lost to Ukrainian forces during a July 2014 offensive, and that DPR forces would be willing to wage heavy battles to do so. Subsequently, Zakharchenko said that he had been misquoted, and that he had meant to say that these areas would be taken through peaceful means. While campaigning in the lead-up to the November 2 elections held by the DPR and LPR in violation of the protocol, Zakharchenko said these are historical times. We are creating a new country. It's an insane goal. OSCE Chairman Didier Burkhalter confirmed that the elections ran counter to the letter and spirit of the Minsk Protocol, and said that they would further complicate its implementation. Speaking on December 5, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the November 2 DPR and LPR elections were exactly within the range in which they had been negotiated in Minsk, and that the Ukrainian parliament was supposed to pass an amnesty bill for DPR and LPR leaders after the Ukrainian parliamentary election in late October. According to Lavrov, closer monitoring of the Russo-Ukrainian border, as specified by the Minsk Protocol, could only take place after such an amnesty law was approved. He noted that he thought that a Ukrainian presidential decree banning prosecution of Donbas separatist combatants was issued on September 16, but said that a bill has now been filed proposing to overturn the decree. Collapse. By January 2015, the Minsk Protocol ceasefire had completely collapsed. Following the separatist victory at Donetsk International Airport in defiance of the protocol, DPR spokesman Eduard Basurin said that the Minsk Memorandum will not be considered in the form it was adopted. Later in the day, DPR leader Alexander Zakharchenko said that the DPR will not make any attempts at ceasefire talks anymore, and that his forces were going to attack right up to the borders of Donetsk region. The New York Times said that the ceasefire had all but vanished. Amidst increasing violence in the combat zone, another round of Minsk talks was scheduled for January 31. Members of the Trilateral Contact Group traveled to Minsk to meet representatives of the DPR and LPR. The DPR and LPR signatories of the protocol did not attend, and those representatives that did attend were not able to discuss the implementation of the protocol or memorandum. These representatives asked for the revision of the protocol and the memorandum. The meeting was adjourned with no result. Minsk 2, February 2015. Successive attempts to resolve the ongoing war in the Donbas region of Ukraine had seen no result by the start of February 2015. While the Minsk Protocol of September 5, 2014 did significantly reduce fighting in the conflict zone for many months, minor skirmishes continued. At the start of January 2015, the separatist forces of the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic began a new offensive on Ukrainian-controlled areas, resulting in the complete collapse of the Minsk Protocol ceasefire. After heavy fighting, DPR forces captured the symbolically important Donetsk International Airport on January 21, the last part of the city of Donetsk that had been under Ukrainian control. Following this victory, separatist forces pressed their offensive on the important railway and road junction of Debaltsev in late January. This renewed heavy fighting caused significant concern in the international community. French President François Hollande and German Chancellor Angela Merkel put forth a new peace plan on 7 February. The Franco-German plan, drawn up after talks with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko and Russian President Vladimir Putin, was seen as a revival of the Minsk Protocol. President Hollande said that the plan was the last chance for resolution of the conflict. The plan was put forth in response to American proposals to send armaments to the Ukrainian government, something that Chancellor Merkel said would only result in a worsening of the crisis. A summit to discuss the implementation of the Franco-German diplomatic plan was scheduled for February 11 at the Independence Palace in Minsk, the capital of Belarus. It was attended by Russian President Vladimir Putin, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President François Hollande, DPR leader Alexander Zakharchenko, and LPR leader Igor Plotnitsky. Negotiations went on overnight for 16 hours, and were said to have been very difficult by the German foreign minister. Following the talks, it was announced on February 12, 2015 that the parties to the conflict had agreed to a new package of peacemaking measures, the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, which is commonly called Minsk II. Some of the measures agreed to were an OSCE-observed unconditional ceasefire from February 15, withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front line, release of prisoners of war, and constitutional reform in Ukraine. Text of the agreement. The full text of the agreement is as follows. Immediate and full ceasefire in particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine and its strict fulfillment as of midnight EET on February 15, 2015. Pull out of all heavy weapons by both sides to equal distance with the aim of creation of a security zone on minimum 50 km apart for artillery of 100 mm caliber or more, and a security zone of 70 km for multiple rocket launchers and 140 km for MLRS Tornado S, Uragan, Smerch, and Tokayu tactical missile systems. For Ukrainian troops, from actual line of contact. For armed formations of particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine, from the contact line in accordance with the Minsk Memorandum as of September 19, 2014. The pullout of the above-mentioned heavy weapons must start no later than the second day after the start of the ceasefire and finish within 14 days. This process will be assisted by OSCE with the support of the Trilateral Contact Group. Effective monitoring and verification of ceasefire regime and pullout of heavy weapons by OSCE will be provided from the first day of pullout, using all necessary technical means such as satellites, drones, radio location systems etc. On the first day after the pullout, a dialogue is to start on modalities of conducting local elections in accordance with the Ukrainian legislation and the law of Ukraine on temporary order of local self-governance in particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, and also about the future of these districts based on the above-mentioned law. Without delays, but no later than 30 days from the date of signing of this document, a resolution has to be approved by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, indicating the territory which falls under the special regime in accordance with the law on temporary order of local self-governance in particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, based in the line set up by the Minsk Memorandum as of September 19, 2014. Provide pardon and amnesty by way of enacting a law that forbids persecution and punishment of persons in relation to events that took place in particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine. Provide release and exchange of all hostages and illegally held persons, based on the principle of all for all. This process has to end at the latest on the fifth day after the pullout. Provide safe access, delivery, storage, and distribution of humanitarian aid to the needy, based on an international mechanism. Define the modalities of a full restoration of social and economic connections, including social transfers, such as payments of pensions and other payments. With this aim, Ukraine will restore management over the segment of its banking system in the districts affected by the conflict, and possibly, an international mechanism will be established to ease such transactions. Restore control of the state border to the Ukrainian government in the whole conflict zone, which has to start on the first day after the local election and end after the full political regulation by the end of 2015, on the condition of fulfillment of Point 11 in consultations and in agreement with representatives of particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts within the framework of the Trilateral Contact Group. Pull out of all foreign armed formations, military equipment, and also mercenaries from the territory of Ukraine under OSCE supervision. Disarmament of all illegal groups. Constitutional reform in Ukraine, with a new constitution to come into effect by the end of 2015, the key element of which is decentralization, and also approval of permanent legislation on the special status of particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in accordance with the measures spelled out in the attached footnote, by the end of 2015. Based on the law of Ukraine on temporary order of local self-governance in particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, questions related to local elections will be discussed and agreed upon with representatives of particular districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in the framework of the Trilateral Contact Group. Elections will be held in accordance with relevant OSCE standards and monitored by OSCE/ODIHR. Intensify the work of the Trilateral Contact Group, including through the establishment of working groups on the implementation of relevant aspects of the Minsk agreements. They will reflect the composition of the Trilateral Contact Group. Signatories. The following representatives signed the document: Swiss diplomat and OSCE representative Heidi Taliavini, former President of Ukraine and Ukrainian representative Leonid Kuchma, Russian ambassador to Ukraine and Russian representative Mikhail Zurabov, rebel heads Alexander Zakharchenko and Igor Plotnitsky. Reactions. The new package, commonly referred to as Minsk II, was criticized for being highly complicated and extremely fragile, and for being very similar to the failed Minsk Protocol. The New York Times reported that the plan had included some tripwires, such as not demarcating control over the city of Debaltsev, which was the site of the most fierce fighting at the time of the plan's drafting. Following the Minsk talks, Chancellor Merkel, President Hollande, and President Poroshenko attended a European Union summit in Brussels. At the summit, the Minsk participants briefed EU leaders about the talks. During the briefing, they said that President Putin had tried to delay the implementation of a ceasefire by 10 days, so as to force Ukrainian troops in Debaltsev to surrender their positions. For his part, President Putin said that the Debaltsev defenders were encircled, and that the separatists expected them to lay down their arms and cease resistance. Kommersant reporter Andriy Kolesnikov wrote that implementation of the ceasefire in Debaltsev hinged upon whether or not Ukrainian forces were truly encircled. Above all, does it exist or not? Vladimir Putin insisted that it exists and that if a ceasefire agreement is reached, it will be odd if it isn't violated. Those in the kettle will certainly try to get out of there. Those who have boiled that kettle will try to collect the foam. U.S. State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki said on February 13 that the Russian armed forces had actively deployed around Debaltsev to assist the separatists in forcing out Ukrainian troops prior to the start of the ceasefire, the February 15. Russia denied this, and Russian government spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Russia could not assist in the implementation of Minsk II because it was not a participant in the conflict. Right sector leader Dmytro Yeresh said that he reserved the right to continue fighting, and that Minsk II was unconstitutional. He said that his Ukrainian volunteer corps would continue fighting until complete liberation of Ukrainian lands from Russian occupants, and promised death to Russian terrorist occupiers. DPR leader Alexander Zakharchenko said that the ceasefire did not apply to Debaltseve, and that fighting would continue there. Efficacy. After the follow-up memorandum, the Second Battle of Donetsk Airport broke out, and both parties continued to accuse each other of ceasefire violations. In late October, DPR Prime Minister and Minsk Protocol signatory Alexander Zakharchenko said that his forces would retake the territory they had lost to Ukrainian forces during a July 2014 offensive, and that DPR forces would be willing to wage heavy battles to do so. Subsequently, Zakharchenko said that he had been misquoted, and that he had meant to say that these areas would be taken through peaceful means. While campaigning in the lead-up to the November 2 elections held by the DPR and LPR in violation of the protocol, Zakharchenko said these are historical times. We are creating a new country. It's an insane goal. OSCE Chairman Didier Burkhalter confirmed that the elections ran counter to the letter and spirit of the Minsk Protocol, and said that they would further complicate its implementation. Speaking on December 5, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the November 2 DPR and LPR elections were exactly within the range in which they had been negotiated in Minsk, and that the Ukrainian parliament was supposed to pass an amnesty bill for DPR and LPR leaders after the Ukrainian parliamentary election in late October. According to Lavrov, closer monitoring of the Russo-Ukrainian border, as specified by the Minsk Protocol, could only take place after such an amnesty law was approved. He noted that he thought that a Ukrainian presidential decree banning prosecution of Donbas separatist combatants was issued on September 16, but said that a bill has now been filed proposing to overturn the decree. Elections in the DPR and LPR. Evaluation and abandonment. Following the fall of Debaltseve in February 2015, about one-third of the Donbas region remained in separatist control. A few days before the 2022 Russian invasion, French President Emmanuel Macron and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken opined that the Minsk agreements were the way forward to end the conflict in Donbas. Blinken added that it was an incomplete step as there were other outstanding issues. The aim of the Russian intervention in Donbas was to establish pro-Russian governments that, upon reincorporation into Ukraine, would facilitate Russian inference in Ukrainian politics. The agreements were thus highly favorable to the Russian side, as their implementation would accomplish these goals. In May and June 2021, Mark Galeotti proposed it is time to recognize that the Minsk process has run its course and may if anything be blocking any more meaningful dialogue, and suggested that as an external party, the United Kingdom might move diplomacy forward. In a June 2021 interview, Vladislav Surkov, Putin's aide for Ukraine policy from 2013 to 2020, who was removed from his role in February 2020, said that Ukraine can be reformed as a confederation, with a lot of freedom for the regions to decide things by themselves. He said the country would be severed by the geopolitical gravity between Russia and the West, describing the Minsk agreements as an act that legitimized the first division of Ukraine in a reconquest, the first open geopolitical counterattack by Russia. In October 2021, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that if the Americans are genuinely prepared to support the implementation of the Minsk agreements, this issue can be settled very quickly. A dispute emerged over the role of the Russian Federation, with the parties understanding Minsk as an agreement between Ukraine and Russia, but Russian officials claiming the role of mediator, insisted that Ukraine negotiate directly with representatives of the self-proclaimed separatist republics in parts of Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he has no intention of talking to terrorists. The Russian side refused high-level talks, and the Kremlin endorsed an October 2021 Kommersant article by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev entitled "Why It Is Senseless to Deal with the Current Ukrainian Leadership," which some have criticized. In November 2021, the Russian Foreign Ministry breached diplomatic protocol by releasing confidential correspondence with negotiators Germany and France. In December 2021, Chief of General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces Valery Gerasimov said that Kyiv is not fulfilling the Minsk agreements. The Ukrainian armed forces are touting that they have started to employ US-supplied Javelin anti-tank missile systems in Donbas and are also using Turkish reconnaissance/strike drones. As a result, the already tense situation in the east of that country is further deteriorating. In January 2022, Alexei Danilov, the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, said that the fulfillment of the Minsk agreement means the country's destruction. When they were signed under the Russian gun barrel and the German and the French watched, it was already clear for all rational people that it's impossible to implement those documents. In February 2022, Finnish President Sauli Niinisto said the most possible solution could be the Minsk agreement to be fulfilled or that there would be significant progress in its implementation. On February 15, 2022, the Russian Duma voted to appeal to President Putin to recognize the self-proclaimed LPR and DPR. The next day, a Russian government spokesman acknowledged that officially recognizing the Donbas republics would not be in keeping with the Minsk agreements. However, he also told journalists that Putin's priority in regulating the situation in Donbas is the implementation of mechanisms adopted under those agreements. Russia went on to officially recognize the self-proclaimed Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics on February 21, 2022. Following that decision, on February 22, 2022, President Putin said that the Minsk agreements no longer existed, and that Ukraine, not Russia, was to blame for their collapse, accusing Ukraine of genocide in Donbas in his comments, a statement largely seen as baseless and factually wrong by the wider world, academics studying genocide, and the United Nations. Russia then invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. On August 24, 2022, after a meeting of the Crimea Platform, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that current front lines in the war would not be frozen. At the point where we are not ready for a ceasefire. We explained that there will be no Minsk 3, Minsk 5, or Minsk 7. We will not play these games. We have lost part of our territories this way. It is a trap.